I didn't like this game. I wanted to open with that right at the beginning. I thought about doing a little speech beforehand, but I want to be nice and honest with you guys. I didn't like this game. If that's going to affect your enjoyment of this rumination, if you don't want to watch the rest of it because of that, totally feel it. I get you. Go ahead and not watch it. That's cool. I understand. Okay, for those of you who are still there, I wanted to be honest about that because one of the things that I've gotten more of in the last year or so at this point is I feel more confident in being completely honest with you guys about things. I know that sounds like a weird statement, but what I mean by that, and I know a lot of you probably understand what I mean. Let's say there's a movie or a game or a book or music that's really popular, but you don't care for it. And so, your friends or people just at work or at school or whatever are talking about it, and they're like, oh, what do you think? And you're like, and you don't want to be ostracized. You don't want to come off as just confrontational. You don't want to stir the pot. So you just kind of go, yeah. And you may or may not lie, but you may just kind of avoid talking about the things that you don't like about it, right? My BioShock rumination is actually a very good example of this, to use something from my own experience, because I didn't actually like BioShock. No, it was a very well-crafted game, and I had plenty to talk about, but I didn't actually like it. And when I revealed that, after that rumination came out, people were like, really? Because I didn't talk about it like that. So I wanted to open with that, being nice and honest, because I feel a little more, like I said, confident, like I don't have to hide or be afraid of what the internet's going to say about me. I've had a lot of people on the internet say a lot of really horrible things about me at this point, so, armor get. Moving on. Now, having started with all that, I do hope you watch the rest of this because I do have a couple of things that I personally found really interesting in this one. I've bundled this game alongside the next game, To the Moon, I believe is the name of it, because both of these games feel like psychology games, analysis games, or psychobabble games if you prefer. I don't really have a better word to use this, so I'm going to rewind a little bit and give you a little bit of backstory. I used to go to school. I know, shocking. And when I used to go to school, we used to have to study psychiatry and psychology. Now, I find certain aspects of human psychology fascinating, and I actually discuss it many times in my videos, the ideas of perspective or opinion or whatever, a better understanding of people kind of thing. But then there's past that. Now, if you asked me to use my honest terminology for that, I'd call it psychobabble, because I feel like too many people get to the point of just kind of making up stuff or really exaggerating or distending certain works or certain concepts of how we think and how we feel in order to try and make themselves feel or look smarter, or just because that's the popular thing to do and has been for centuries at this point. This is nothing new. That is, of course, my opinion. But I do think there is a point at which we just go a little bit too far when it comes to psychology and psychiatry. Now, that being said, there's like an in-between there. There's like basic psychology, which is what I usually refer to. Then at the far end, we've got psychobabble. But in the middle, there's this weird sweet spot, which I'm just going to call weird stuff, because I don't have the proper terminology here. So the weird stuff is stuff that I get, but I don't really like. Like I look at it, it's like, I don't want to do that. And going back to my school comment earlier, when we used to study the weird stuff in the middle, it was just like, really? That was always my feeling, like every time through those classes. Really? Do I have to? Yes, this and that, and oh, God. I hated studying Freud. This is off topic. I personally consider Freud to be a hack. I wouldn't call him amongst the annals of actually good psychologists or psychiatrists. And by the way, I keep using both terms because even though they refer to different concepts of this whole category, I don't remember what the umbrella term is for this category. So if I keep saying psychologist and psychiatrist, it's because I'm trying to be inclusive, and I can't remember the word. Moving on. What does this have to do with Killer is Dead? What does this have to do with To the Moon? Both of these games are in the weird category there, my opinion. But having gone through this one and having already started some of the work for To the Moon, it feels like these were games that were not built to have awesome gameplay, which is one of the usual reasons to make a game. Mario Brothers 1, just to use a really basic example. Not games that were made to tell an amazing story. Final Fantasy 2, good example. But these were games that were designed, again, my opinion, I know I keep saying that, but I really want to emphasize that because I'm probably completely wrong, and anybody who's actually a big fan of the Suda51 series, or Grasshopper, Greenhouse, whatever they're called games, was probably going to be like, oh my god, he's an idiot. By the way, I'm not a big fan of the series, and this is my first one I've played in the series. But if I'm wrong, that's fine, but from an outsider's perspective, these feel like games that are trying to be psychological. Psychiatrical. That's a word I just made up. You can enjoy it. These are games that I feel aren't really trying to tell a story, aren't really focused on amazing gameplay. I feel like these are games that are more trying to slice apart human nature, pun intended, and put it up on display, really analyze the kind of concepts and vagaries that come with that weird category. And if I keep struggling for words, it's because I really don't have the vocabulary to describe what I'm trying for. I would just use my own words, but then it would sound like, so this game has a lot of going on, and then there's this scene, which is kind of cool, but then it goes, and that's not going to be very informative. Now that I've spent the first 5 minutes discussing all this, let's actually get to the game proper. I wanted to start with that, though, because my very first thought when I was playing this game was that it was weird for weird's sake. I no longer think that. There's certainly some weird on display, but I think all of the weird is in service of that earlier point. Keeping in mind, I didn't like this game, but I do defend this. I do think that the idea was that they were trying to be literally representative with regards to the visuals especially, and the way the stages were designed, the way the bosses were designed, the outfits of the characters, David being a big example on that one, Alice, is another one, the way the wires functioned in general, all that stuff. All of that I feel was trying to be much more literal than I earlier thought. Now, as a quick aside, I am aware of the fact that Suda51 did not completely run this game. He was involved, as a writer especially, but I'm not sure 100% how much influence he had in the overall production of this game, but if I ever refer to it as a Suda51 work, then that's why. Just really quick. I've heard this game described as a combination of No More Heroes and Killer 7 in terms of gameplay and presentation and story, respectively. Again, I haven't actually played those games, so I'm going to have to go with other people's word on that. But it does feel like someone sat there and was like, let's try to make something out of this, and this is what we got. I do have to say something, though, really quick. I don't know if the dialogue is bad, or if it was badly localized. Because going through a lot of the cutscenes and the way that people, everyone's in a room and we keep having these sharp camera angles from person to person, and they say things. It reminded me of watching Phantom Menace, Star Wars Phantom Menace, because there's a lot of the dialogue that in no way sounds like dialogue. It doesn't sound like a conversation. It sounds like people saying random things, and it would shift in tone, and in some cases, one person would say something, and then a second person would say something completely unrelated, and then shift back into responding what that person said. It just felt disjointed. I'm not sure if that was purposeful, or if that's a localization problem. Anybody who knows, feel free to let me know. I'm not aware. It just was weird. This is a very, very flashy game. I hate to give another complaint about this game, but I found the UI, the user interface, to be bleh, or bleh, if you prefer. Seriously, though, it was so flashy and so difficult for me to see. For those of you not aware, I have a mild form of color blindness, and so certain colors I just have difficulty differentiating against certain other colors, and that gets really bad in the gray to brown palette for me. I had that problem in Dark Souls 3, for example. So there are several times when I actually found myself having trouble literally seeing what was on my screen. I mean, specifically with the interface. The gameplay, the level design was fine with that, but I'd look over like, okay. And it was really, really flashy. I actually had a similar problem with the Persona series, for basically the same reason. The game itself is very flashy. This is probably one of the most classic examples of a spectacle fighter that I've ever seen. Not my favorite, and that brings me to my third and final complaint, I swear. I didn't actually care for the gameplay that much. I don't think it was bad. In fact, I would argue very strongly that it was good. It just was merely good. Because when I first started playing it, PS3 version, for those curious, when I first started playing it, I'm like, okay, this is cool. You know, combo, dodge, block, break their block, sub-weapon every now and again. All of that stuff. I'm with it. Okay, cool. But it never really went anywhere from that, my opinion. You can, of course, get more blood, level up, go be a gigolo. I'll talk about that in a second. I lied. There's one more complaint. Sorry, guys. But you can add to it, but never. You can expand what you can. How do I phrase this right? You have a shovel. You can make this shovel really good, but you're always stuck with just a shovel. And just in my opinion, what I think spectacle fighters need is more variety than that. God of War 2 and Devil May Cry 3, my two personal favorite spectacle fighters, although Darksiders is pretty high up there too. Darksiders does this as well. They vary up the style of gameplay. You know, you switch a weapon, and the whole method by which you play is different with the new weapon. And you can flow back and forth between this weapon or this sub-weapon or this magic or whatever from the game. And I like that control. Devil May Cry 3 is probably my personal favorite spectacle fighter of all time in the sheer level of control and how much the gameplay and the combat was up to you to do, rather than just doing a combo, which is button, heavy button, heavy button, button, heavy button, you know? Instead, it's like button, button, pull back, dodge over this way. In many ways, it felt a little bit more like a fighting game, more than anything. And I think that was to its overall goodness meant. Goodness meant? What's the opposite of detriment? Benefit. It was to its overall benefit. I'm kind of tired. Sorry, guys. So I felt like it was good gameplay, and I did enjoy slicing and hacking and dashing my way through it, but I'll be honest, I ended up turning the difficulty down a bit just because the excess amount of health on some of the enemies made it kind of boring after a bit. So let's get the final complaint out of the way now. Gigolo. Oh my god. Okay. Anybody who knows me and has watched me for any length of time knows that I am a prude. And I no longer try to hide that. In fact, I'm not ashamed of it or anything. It's just me. It's just the way I am. However, I have often said stridently that if you're going to have some kind of romance or relationship or sex in a fictional work, it needs to serve some kind of purpose other than being one of those three things. It needs to actually service the characters, or service for the plot, or service for the setting, or be a strongly connected scene. Something. You know, don't just throw character A and character B together and expect me to care. Make it matter, right? Or make it be a natural development of their characters. Or make it strengthen both their characters, right? So, in this game, there's the Gigolo missions, which are probably the most directly opposite to that I could think of. Because you sit down next to random woman B, and you make eye contact, and then you stare at her assets, and then you... there's a couple other mini-gamey things you can do. You fill up the heart meter, you give her gifts, then you go, and they don't show anything. Credit where credit is due. They don't actually show anything. But obviously, stuff happens. And then you get a sub-weapon. Yes, this little awkward and frankly uncomfortable minigame, I actively didn't like it. I feel like the gameplay part of the minigame was bad, and it made me uncomfortable. Again, I'm a prude, but the whole time I'm just like, wow, this is just awkward. Like, this isn't just like watching a bad porno. This is like seeing a really awkward Peter Parker from Spider-Man 3 trying to do the dance moves, kind of awkward. You know what I mean? If you haven't seen what I'm talking about, well, then that's awesome. Never watched that movie. Anyways, so, and then you get, and then it's sub-weapons. That's how you get the sub-weapons. I don't even know what to say about that. Now, of course, these are mostly optional, and that's, of course, the argument I can already hear being levied at this, but they're kind of optional. In truth, in fact, I never found out if they were 100% optional. I ended up doing them because what happens is if you skip them or don't do them, they call you up in the middle of or during the main quest chain and are like, hey! And it's like, what? Why don't you come see me more? I'm kind of killing someone right now. What? I... Anyways. And of course, if you want the sub-weapons, you need to... Yeah. Whatever. I do... There's one other bit. David and Mondo keep kind of breaking the fourth wall. I mean, this is an action game, right? We can't go conquer the world. It would make the gamers upset. Again, I feel like this is a localization issue, because the core of the joke there is funny. And I did actually chuckle at a couple of the fourth wall breaks. But they kept doing it, which is the first problem. And the second problem was the delivery wasn't quite there, either in the dialogue or in the voice acting. Some good voice actors in this game, too. It's weird. I believe Liam O'Brien was in this one. Anyways. So, I swear that's all I have to say about negatives. Now, unfortunately, I don't have much else to talk about. But I'm going to try. I'm going to do my best here. So, first of all, I like how Osama Bin Laden is part of the backstory of this game. Really. I found an interview where they talked about how Mondo got his arm. And apparently when he killed Osama Bin Laden, for those of you not aware of the series and how this works, this is a... magic is everyday kind of a thing. And of course, cybernetics and high-tech are very common. You know, taking a random trip to the moon, having a literal mansion on the moon is kind of normal at this point in history. And the fact that there's magic and monsters and literal dark matter, which is personified essence of humans' evil, that's normal. And it's always treated as normal. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. So, that being said, when you kill someone who's really evil, there's this of evil energy. Dark matter is what they call it. And so the dark matter got him, and he had to replace his arm with the muscle back, and that actually helps him to resist the darkness, also known as the dark matter. I find that amusing. Let's go... I said I'd talk about it. Let's rewind a step. So, one of the things I did actually like, very much so, was the idea of the completely mundane, magical nature of the setting. This is a setting in which, again, human evil is a literal thing, and that's normal. So the dark matter, the moon acts as sort of a filter / sponge for humanity's evil, draws it up into the moon and just kind of stores it there in large quantities. Now, occasionally, and this is normal, a little bit seeps out and gets down to Earth. But even a very small bit of this will either literally destroy you, melt you, or will turn you into a wire, talk about that in a moment, or convert you into a sentient wire, which I'll also talk about in a moment. And that's normal. But another interesting thing, and I alluded to this with the earlier Obama thing, is if you kill someone, if someone dies with an amount of dark matter within them, obviously the majority of that dark matter goes back up to the moon, but there's a little bit of a dispersal effect. You know, and there's just this cloud of just enough dark matter that might infect the area. Now, there are ways to filter yourself to be protected from dark matter, like the muscle-back arm that we have on Mondo. But, you know, random civilians? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities here for that going very, very badly, and there's a few hints of that throughout the game. But I love that concept. The whole idea of that caught my attention, and it was one of the first things I learned about this game, actually, and one of the things that made me most interested in playing through it, other than the fact that it's my job. I was really hoping for more explanation, more, you know, why is the moon doing this? Is this an artificial thing? I was left with the impression, forgive me for jumping ahead a bit, that the moon is a construct, or I'm saying that wrong, that the moon has been constructed in order to do this function. The final battle literally happens in a crater filled with dark matter, and we see these just gouts of dark matter reaching out to the Earth. So I got the very strong impression that it was designed, probably by the Moon Rivers, in order to accomplish this function, in order to safeguard the world and take care of it. I mean, she herself flat out says we could have purged the Earth easily. We didn't. We liked watching instead. And so I love the idea of, in order to maintain their particular desire, keep that word in the back of your mind, by the way, they decided to start absorbing all of this dark matter from the Earth, pulling it up into the moon and keeping it in a much more contained format. The implication is also there, although this might be reading too much into it, that before this really got started, before the moon was used as this sort of evil sponge, that the Earth was in a lot worse of a state. And knowing history like I do, I could totally see that. But the idea there being that the explanation for why most of Earth history has been so violent, so bloody, so depraved, so disgusting, was because dark matter was just all over the place. Oh, ghosts. There's also ghosts in this setting. Anyways. Now, having discussed that, let's talk about the wires briefly. The wires obviously function as default bad guys for this. They're people who have been completely consumed by dark matter and have manifested cybernetics. I don't know why human evil manifests as cybernetics. I mean, I could make the obvious joke there, but that's a little bit too obvious even for me. You can go ahead and fill in the blanks on that one if you want to. Nevertheless, so they become more or less literally cyborg zombies, is effectively what the wires are. They are broken down to effectively a bestial level, and you kill them en masse, as is the job of the default bad guy. That's what they're there for. I don't actually have much else to say about that, other than their relation to the higher tier wires, because individuals like Alice were a wire as well. Victor was a wire. David himself was a wire. But they are higher tier wires. I'm reminded of all things of Kingdom Hearts, because there's nobodies, like Dusks, and then there's nobodies, like Xemnas. And there's a pretty big difference between the two, because one of them is effectively a mindless little creature that has said one line of dialogue in the entire series, and the other one is a sapient sentient being, right? But I feel the same distinction exists here, and it is my opinion, based on what we see, that it has to do with the desires of the individual and how much that matters to them. Because one of the things we see about the higher tier wires is that whatever it is they want, whatever it is that is their goal or their perspective, the aspects of their personality are distended to the point of ludicrous extremism. Victor is probably the best example of this by far. At least I hope I'm using the right name. The musician. The guy who saw nothing wrong with what he was doing, who was actually trying to accomplish a great good, at least from his perspective, because that's what he wanted. He wanted to spread that music. He wanted to use that across the whole world, and it just kind of got warped and warped and warped until it was, again, ludicrous, to a ludicrous point of extremism. And so we see amongst these higher tier wires that the only way they're able to retain any sense of self is by fixating on something. And this brings me back to my point. I think this is a matter of will and a matter of, I'm going to keep using this word, desire. The idea that they either want something sufficiently badly, revenge is another example. I can't remember his name, but there was the gentleman who really wanted revenge. Or having a sufficiently strong will to combat the dark matter within you. However, it is also mentioned that no matter how strong your will, eventually you will succumb to that dark matter. It's kind of an inevitable thing. But I mention this because I think this helps explain the lesser wires as well. That the lesser wires are people who either did not have a sufficiently powerful will, or did not have a strong enough desire within them in order to become anything other than a mindless roving beast. Some of you have probably already seen where I'm drawing the psycho weirdness parallel in here. I'm building up to it, I swear. Next thing I want to talk about with regards to, we've got the dark matters, we've got the wires, we've got the moon. I've kind of already talked about the moon. This is a quick aside. I love the fact that inflation has run rampant, and that getting proper funding for their, despite being government funded, they still need more money just to be able to operate. It's a nice little flavor touch that adds some unusual amount of realism to an otherwise very unrealistic game. I just wanted to mention that really quick. But anyways, there's a lot of color usage in this game as well. Obviously purple being the color of dark matter, which I could talk about its relation to the purple royalty, etc. But more to the point, purple is specifically something that is used consistently throughout the entire work as a means of trying to explain something that is base. I think is the best word I want to use for that. To explain what I mean, if I want to play FF6, that's not a base desire, is it? That's a complex desire. That is me wanting to have intellectual stimulation, emotional impact, and enjoyable activity. Pretty much all wrapped up. That's not a base desire. If I want to eat a giant burger, that is a base desire. I am, in fact, hungry as I'm doing this rumination. I'm going to go get lunch right after this, I swear. Don't worry, guys. I'm going to eat. But, that's a base desire, right? In almost every time it's used, purple is used alongside the idea of just wanting something really basic and wanting it quite a lot. And that ties into my final point. I'm actually already at my final point, so I guess whatever. Now, we're getting into the point of speculation. The ending of this game is rather open-ended, so you can kind of assume whatever you want about it. It's a fairly Gainax ending, but I do have my own thoughts about it, and that is kind of my job to ruminate on these things. So I would actually really like it if any of you guys out there who actually have played this game or like this game would share your own theories about what happened and why. But Mondo is, in my opinion, very selfish. His desires are very basic, very carnal, and very normal. He wants. And that is pretty much the sole aspect of characterization that Mondo receives. We don't really learn much about his backstory, even when it is revealed to us. We don't learn about some deep characterization. He has no particular character arc. The only thing we have to define Mondo is that he wants. Nothing else. What am I listening to? Anyways, and this actually could be said for several other characters as well, but no one nearly as strongly as Mondo. Thereafter, we have the opposite character, David, who also wants, but in a very different way. Because Mondo is a very clear and psychological example of a psychopath. I don't mean in the usage of the term which I usually use and other people usually use. I mean in the sense that he literally comes across as someone with psychopathy, or who has a psychopathic mentality. Best example of this is the scene where the two of them are sitting, and he says, I have to go kill, what's-her-face, the Moon River lady, one of the Moon Rivers, in order to give you the moon. And Mondo says, no, and automatically the psychopathic response to that is to assume that the only possible reason that Mondo would not respond positively to his completely reasonable statement of murdering someone to give the moon to him is because of the fact that he wants more. Very classic response there. Misunderstanding, misdirection, and extremism, again, being put into point. Forgive me for not knowing the proper psychological terms, but I have actually studied this, I swear, and I have a feeling that that's what this was going for very deliberately, because as I mentioned before, just about all of the wires, and David himself is the best example, are in their own mentality, in their own twisted mindset, in the way they are thinking, are actually behaving in a fake altruistic way. That they feel like what they are doing is for others, that they feel what they're doing is to benefit those who are not themselves. They still want, they still have their own desires, but those desires are expressed outwards, externally, rather than, say, Mondo's desire, which is expressed purely internally. Mondo at no point tries to present himself as anything other than just out for himself, with, I think, the sole exception of offering for Mika to be his assistant. I think that's the one time he did something out of a pseudo-altruistic desire. Small little point. I mentioned the carnal thing. It is my opinion, and I hate to get into this, and this is certainly some Freudian stuff here, but it is my opinion that one of Mondo's primary motivations is sex. And I hate to just lay that out there bluntly, but it's true. Obviously, there's the gigolo stuff, but one of my favorite examples of this is actually when one of the Moon Rivers comes down and says, hey, I want to do this job. And the guy says, no, money ain't going to do it. And the guy says, I'll do it for a kiss. Now, that seems like just a weird scene. When I first saw that, I just kind of brushed it off as, okay, whatever. It's weird. Remember, weird for word's sake, like I mentioned earlier. But I think that was actually trying to emphasize his perspective and his more inwardly focused desire. whereas everyone else has a more externally focused desire that has been artificially warped by this dark matter, which is best described as humanity. And you can probably see why where this whole psychology thing is starting to build up here. Because I think this is a little less literal than I would actually prefer. I have a very linear mind, I have a very literal mind, and I don't like to look at something that's being intended as a pure allegory or a tale, as I've called it before. But I do think that's what this is. I do think this is a tale rather than a literal story. I think this is an example of trying to present human needs and human desires, the contrast between the two, and the way in which one can be morphed, mutated, and warped by external influences in order to take something that is, at least on paper, good and turn it into something horrifically wrong and evil. And of course, nowhere is this more present in the ending. Now, this is where we get into some interesting theory crafting, because nobody knows what the hell actually happened in the ending except for the people who wrote it, and to my knowledge, they're not talking. Trust me, I looked. I read quite a few interviews from the developers and from Suda51 himself trying to find an answer for the ending. Never found one. If you know of one, please feel free to share. But my take on it is one of two things, and I'm not going to say which one I think it is because I think most are equally possible as far as what could be happening here. Possibility number one. This is the obvious thing, that Mondo has become the evil darkness, and soon he shall rule on high as Sultan. I don't actually think that's that likely, to be 100% honest, but it is... I shouldn't say that. That's not the one it is the one that is most likely, but is the one that I like the least, because in my opinion, it doesn't do anything. It's like a twist with no reason. There's no narrative conclusion to the idea that Mondo becomes the bad guy, because they never built up to that. There was no real parallels between him and David, other than the fact that they were opposites, Mondo being the moon, David being the earth, and Mika being the sun. I'm not going to get into that. So, the idea of this presentation is that, in my opinion, second reason for what's happening, or second explanation of what's happening, Mondo has actually developed forward and decided to, I know this is going to sound really boring, grow up. I think he has taken his internal desires, his selfish desires, and is now using that selfish desire in order to manipulate the external force. Now, there's actually a mindset within psychology that thinks of this, and forgive me for not knowing the terms, but the term in psychology is the idea that you have to be honest about your selfishness and embrace your selfishness to truly help others, whereas trying to artificially be altruistic will lead to bad things. I don't remember what that's called, forgive me, but it's a thing. And I feel like that's the presentation that they're going for here with the ending, that Mondo, having embraced his own selfish nature and rejected the nature of the other wires, is now able to use the dark matter properly in order to keep it nice and contained, rebuilding the mansion in order to rebuild the infrastructure. Again, my theory that the moon was an artificial design in order to keep this dark matter contained, in order to make sure that the planet's cool, because of course he'd want to do that. There's a lot of hot women down there. And I know that sounds basic, but I think that's the point. It is a base desire. And I don't actually have much else to say. I'm very curious what you guys think. This is a weird one to go through. Next week we'll be doing To the Moon, and I hope I'll see you guys for that.